Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 75 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4. We are today starting with chapter 28 of the fourth canto. Chapter 28 is titled Puranjan becomes a woman in the next life. Pretty amazing chapter. But first of all, let us chant our prayers. Nama Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadejatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripas sindhubhya evacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. So, okay. So there are 65 verses in this chapter. Means it's a big chapter. 65 verses, and we've divided them into 9 sections. Let us just run through those sections. First of all, first section, verse 1 to verse 12. Puranjan's city overcome by Gandharva and Yavana soldiers. Second section, verse 13 to 15. The serpent wants to leave the city. Third section, verse 16 to verse 22. Puranjan panics. Fourth section, verse 23 to verse 27. Puranjan, taken away by Yavanaraj, gives up his body. Fifth section, it's just 1 verse 28. In his next life, Puranjan is born as the daughter of the king of King Vidarbha. Sixth section, verse 29 to 32. Malaya Dwaja marries Vaidarbhi. The name of Puranjan in his next life as the daughter of Vidarbha. Seventh section, verse 33 to verse 44. Malaya Dwaja leaves home. Eighth section, verse 45 to verse 50, Malaya Dwaja passes away. And the ninth section, last section, verse 51 to verse 65, the old Brahmin appears on the scene. Right, so there you go, devotees. That's chapter 28. Puranjan becomes a woman in the next life. Let us begin with section 1, verse 1 to verse 12. Puranjan's city overcome by Gandharva and Yavana soldiers. Right, so verse 1, the great sage Narada continued, My dear King Prachanabarhishat, afterward, the king of the Yavanas, whose name is fear itself, as well as Prajvara, Kalakanya, and his soldiers, began to travel all over the world. Verse 2. Once the dangerous soldiers attacked the city of Puranjan with great force. Although the city was full of paraphernalia for sense gratification, it was being protected by the old serpent. Verse 3. Gradually, Kalakanya, with the help of dangerous soldiers, attacked all the inhabitants of Puranjan city and thus rendered them useless for all purposes. Don't forget, Puranjan's city means Puranjan's body. Verse 4, when Kalakanya, daughter of Time, attacked the body, the dangerous soldiers of the king of the Yavanas entered the city through different gates. They then began to give severe trouble to all the citizens. Verse 5, when the city was thus endangered by the soldiers and Kalakanya, King Puranjan, being overly absorbed in affection for his family, was placed in difficulty by the attack of Yavanaraj and Kalakanya. Verse 6, when King Puranjan was embraced by Kalakanya, he gradually lost all his beauty. Having been too much addicted to sex, he became very poor in intelligence and lost all his opulence. Being bereft of all possessions, he was conquered forcibly by the Gandharvas and the Yavanas. Right, verse 7. King Puranjan then saw that everything in his town was scattered, and that his sons, grandsons, servants, and ministers were all gradually opposing him. He also noted that his wife was becoming cold and indifferent. Verse 8, when King Puranjan saw that all his family members, relatives, followers, servants, secretaries, and everyone else had turned against him, he certainly became very anxious, but he could not counteract the situation because he was thoroughly overwhelmed by Kalakanya. Verse 9, the objects of enjoyment became stale by the influence of Kalakanya. Due to the continuance of his lusty desires, King Puranjan became very poor in everything. Thus, he did not understand the aim of life. He was still very affectionate toward his wife and children, and he worried about maintaining them. Verse 10, the city of Puranjan was overcome by the Gandharva and Yavana soldiers, and although the king had no desire to leave the city, he was circumstantially forced to do so, for it was smashed by Kalakanya. Verse 11, under the circumstances, the elder brother of Yavanaraj, known as Prajvara, set fire to the city to please his younger brother, whose other name is Fear itself. 12. When the city was set ablaze, all the citizens and servants of the king, as well as all family members, sons, grandsons, wives, and other relatives, were within the fire. King Puranjan thus became very unhappy. So let's go back to the beginning and go through again with the purports. Verse 1. So this is from verse 1 to verse 12. Puranjan's city overcome by Gandharva and Yavana soldiers. Verse 1. The great sage Narada continued, my dear King Prachinabarhishat, afterward, the king of the Yavanas, whose name is Fear itself, as well as Prajvara, Kalakanya, and his soldiers, began to travel all over the world. So, right, let's have a look at Prabhupada's purport. Prabhupada says the period before death is very dangerous because the weakness of old age and diseases attack. So the diseases which attack the body, they're compared to soldiers, but not ordinary soldiers, because they are guided. They are guided by Yavanaraja's commander-in-chief. The term Dishtakarina indicates that he is their commander. The king of the Yavanas is the commander-in-chief. So, Prabhupada, of course, mentions, when a man is young, he doesn't care about old age, just tries to have sex as much as possible. Doesn't know that at the end of life his sexual indulgence will cause many diseases. It's so horrible. The whole experience is so horrible. One will pray for immediate death. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, the more one enjoys sex during youth, the more he suffers in old age. Verse 2, once the dangerous soldiers attacked the city of Paranjan with great force. Although the city was full of paraphernalia for sense gratification, it was being protected by the old serpent. Right, so let's go through the purport by Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada explains, as you do more for sense gratification, the weaker the body becomes, even daily. And finally becomes so weak, compared to the old serpent, the life air is compared to the serpent. So when the vital force becomes weak, the whole body becomes weak. And at that time, the death symptoms, which are Yamaraja's soldiers, they attack very severely. So the thing is that according to the Vedic system, before you come to the stage, you should leave home, take sannyas, and preach for the rest of your life. Actually, that's what you should do. However, if you stay home, being served by your wife and living very nicely and comfortably in that way, then you just gradually become weaker due to sense gratification. And when death comes, under those circumstances, when death comes, then you leave the body with no spiritual assets. And Prabhupada makes the point, now, even the oldest people, they just don't leave home. But at the end they worry, who is going to take care of my wife? How will she manage her responsibilities? In this way, the man usually thinks of his wife at death. And Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 8, verse 6, Yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajatyante kalevaram tam tam evaiti konteya sada tad bhava bhavita. Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, that state he will attain without fail. So the second paragraph, at the end of life, a person thinks of what he's done throughout his whole life, and thus gets a body in those terms in the next life. So if he's addicted to home, naturally thinks of his wife at the end. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, consequently, in the next life he gets the body of a woman. And he also acquires the results of his pious or impious activities. In this chapter, the acceptance of a woman's body by King Paranjan will be thoroughly explained. Indeed, Verse 3, gradually Kalakanya, with the help of dangerous soldiers, attacked all the inhabitants of Puranjan's city, and thus rendered them useless for all purposes. And don't forget, devotees, attacked all the inhabitants of Puranjan's city. What is Puranjan's city? It's his body. So all the different parts of the body, they just become so weak and hopeless, as the verse says, they're rendered useless for all purposes. So, so Prabhupada's purport, at the end of life, the body becomes useless for anything. Therefore, Vedic training is that in boyhood, he should be trained as a brahmachari, completely engaged in the Lord's service, no association with women. Then when between 20 and 25, he can marry. And at that age, he can immediately beget strong sons. But nowadays, because the young men are weak, more women are being born. If the husband's stronger, male children will be born. So therefore, brahmacharya is essential if we want male children. Then at 50, give up family life. Husband and wife travel on pilgrimage as vanaprasthas. And then later, when they're completely detached from family and home, the wife returns home, lives under the children, aloof from family affairs, and the husband takes sannyas. So, second paragraph, Prabhupada expresses, this is the perfect system of civilization. The human form of life is especially meant for God realization. So, even if you're not trained from childhood, at least in old age, you can be trained for accepting the principles of Krishna consciousness. Yeah, even if you're not trained from childhood, you can be trained in Krishna consciousness in your old age as much as is possible. But usually, if there's no training in childhood, then they can't give up the family at the end. But Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, this is the situation with the city of Puranjan, figuratively described in these verses. Verse 4, when Kalakanya, the daughter of time, attacked the body, the dangerous soldiers of the king of the Yavanas entered the city through different gates. They then began to give severe trouble to all the citizens. So Srila Prabhupada repeats from before what are the 9 gates of the body: 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, mouth, rectum, and genitals. So in old age, diseases develop at these gates. The eyes become dim, so you need glasses. Yes, it's true. The ears can't hear properly. Mucus blocks the nostrils. Oh, Krishna. And the mouth needs false teeth. The rectum also gives trouble. Evacuating becomes difficult. Some cases you have to take enemas and you need help to release urine. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, in this way the city of Puranjan was attacked at various gates by the soldiers. Thus in old age all the gates of the body are blocked by so many diseases, and one has to take help from so many medicines and surgical appliances. Verse 5, when the city, and don't forget that means the body, when the city was thus endangered by the soldiers in Kalakanya, King Puranjan, being overly absorbed in affection for his family, was placed in difficulty by the attack of Yavanaraj and Kalakanya. So Srila Prabhupada says in his purport, when we talk of the body, we talk of the gross and subtle bodies. In old age, they all become weak when they're attacked by different diseases. So the proprietor of the body, the soul, becomes sad at not being able to use the field of activities properly. Kshetra and Kshetragya. Yeah, his body is known as the Kshetra, the field of activities, and the soul is the knower of the field, is called Kshetragya, knower of the body. So yes, when the field's overgrown with thorns and weeds, it becomes difficult for the owner to work it. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, that is the position of the spirit soul when the body itself becomes a burden due to disease. Extra burdens are placed on the body in the form of anxiety and general deterioration of the bodily functions. Verse 6. When King Puranjan was embraced by Kalakanya, he gradually lost all his beauty. Having been too much addicted to sex, he became very poor in intelligence and lost all his opulence. Being bereft of all possessions, he was conquered forcibly by the Gandharvas and the Yavanas. So there's very short purport here, 2 sentences, I'll just read it. When a person is attacked by the invalidity of old age and is still addicted to sense gratification, he gradually loses all his personal beauty, intelligence, and good possessions. He thus cannot resist the forceful attack of the daughter of time. Verse 7, King Puranjan then saw that everything in his town was scattered, and that his sons, grandsons, servants, and ministers were all gradually opposing him. He also noted that his wife was becoming cold and indifferent. So, Srila Prabhupada explains in the purport that when you become invalid, the senses and the organs are weakened. So in other words, they're no longer under your control. And then the senses and sense objects begin to oppose you. So when a person is distressed, then even the family members, sons, grandsons, wife, they become disrespectful. And it becomes clear they're no longer under your command. So Prabhupada explains that just as we wish to use our senses for sense gratification, but they need strength from the body. So therefore a man keeps his family for enjoyment, and they demand enjoyment from him. And when they don't get money from him, they become disinterested. They ignore his commands. So this is due to you becoming a kripana, a miser, which is opposite to being a Brahmin. So we should become Brahmins, understand the absolute truth, and engage in devotional service. In the human form we get this chance, but if we don't take it, we remain Kripana. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, we can actually see that when one has money but does not spend it, he remains a miser and is never happy. Similarly, when one's intelligence is spoiled due to sense gratification, he remains a miser throughout his life. Verse 8. When King Puranjan saw that all his family members, relatives, followers, servants, secretaries, and everyone else had turned against him, he certainly became very anxious. But he could not counteract the situation because he was thoroughly overwhelmed by Kalakanya. So again, there's another very short purport, which I'll just read. When a person becomes weak from the attack of old age, the family members, servants, and secretaries do not care for him. He's then unable to counteract this. Thus he becomes more and more anxious and laments his frightful condition. Verse 9. The objects of enjoyment become stale by the influence of Kalakanya. Or rather, the objects of enjoyment became stale by the influence of Kalakanya. Due to the continuance of his lusty desires, King Puranjan became very poor in everything. Thus he did not understand the aim of life. He was still very affectionate toward his wife and children, and he worried about maintaining them. So Srila Prabhupada, in his short purport, explains this is exactly the position of present society. Everyone is maintaining their body, home, family, and as a result, everyone becomes confused at the end of life. They don't know what is spiritual life. What is the goal of human life? They just don't know. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, in a civilization of sense gratification, there cannot be spiritual life because a person thinks only of this life. Although the next life is a fact, no information is given about it. So verse 10. The city of King Puranjan was overcome by the Gandharva and Yavana soldiers, and although the king had no desire to leave the city, he was circumstantially forced to do so, for it was smashed by Kalakanya. So here, this is interesting. There's a purport with a couple of paragraphs, even 3. And right at the beginning, Srila Prabhupada gives an analysis of what is Krishna consciousness when you're separated from the association of the Lord. So, first of all, the living entity wants to enjoy independently from Krishna. It's given a chance by getting a material body from Brahma down to the microbe. At the time, from the Vedic history of creation, we understand that the first living creature was Lord Brahma, and he created the 7 great sages and other Prajapatis to increase the universal population. So then every living entity, according to their karma, past desires, activities, they all get some sort of body from Brahma down to that of a worm stall. So, but due to a long association with a particular type of material body, and then also due to the grace of Kala Kanya and her Maya, one becomes overly attached to the material body, right? Even though it's the abode of pain. So even if we take worms from a worm from stool, he won't want to leave. The hog likes to live in filthy places, but if we try to give it a nice place, it won't leave. So if we study each living entity, we'll see how he defies offers of better positions. Although Puranjan was attacked from all sides, he was unwilling to leave the city, means his body. So the living entity never wants to give up his or her body, but they'll be forced to. Second paragraph. This is continuing the story of what is Krishna consciousness. So a living entity wants to enjoy this world in different ways, and therefore gets to transmigrate from the body of an infant to a child, to a boy, to a youth, to a man. This process is just going on. And at the last stage, when the gross body is old and invalid, the living entity is reluctant to leave it, even though it's unusable. So why does he not want to leave? Why does he not want to leave? Anyway, even though material life, the material body, they're not comfortable at all. Of course, while you're living in a material body, you have to work hard to maintain it. But unfortunately, society has no information of the soul's transmigration. And because he doesn't hope to enter the spiritual kingdom of bliss, knowledge, eternity, he wants to stick to the present body, even though it's useless. So the greatest welfare activity in the material world is furthering the Krishna consciousness movement. So third paragraph, this movement, Krishna consciousness movement, is giving humanity information about the kingdom of God. That there is God, there is Krishna, and everyone can go back to God and live there eternally in bliss and knowledge. So like this, the Krishna conscious person is not afraid to give up the body because his position's always eternal. When he's within the body, he's happy to do devotional service. And when he leaves the body, he's happy to continue in the service of the Lord, permanently situated. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, the saintly devotees are always free and liberated, whereas the karmis, who have no knowledge of spiritual life or of the transcendental loving service of the Lord, are very much afraid of giving up the rotten material body. All right, verse 11. Under the circumstances, the elder brother of Yavana Raj, known as Prajvara, set fire to the city to please his younger brother, whose other name is fear itself. So again, there is a short purport. I'll just read it through. According to the Vedic system, a dead body is set on fire, but before death there's another fire or fever, which is called Prajvara or Vishnu Jwara. Medical science verifies that when one's temperature is raised to 107 degrees Fahrenheit, a man immediately dies. This Prajvara or higher fever at the last stage of life places the living entity in the midst of a blazing fire. Yeah, so he set fire to the body. Verse 12, when the city, the body, when the city was set ablaze, all the citizens and servants of the king, as well as all family members, sons, grandsons, wives, and other relatives, were within the fire. King Puranjan thus became very unhappy. So Prabhupada in his purport begins by saying, there are many parts of the body, the senses, the limbs, the skin, the muscles, blood, marrow, etc. And all these are considered here figuratively as sons, grandsons, citizens, and dependents. You get the idea? Yeah. All these bodily parts, senses, limbs, skin, muscles, etc. They're considered here figuratively as sons, grandsons, citizens, and dependents. So when the body is attacked by Vishnu Dwara, which is a fiery condition so acute one remains in coma, it means the body is in such severe pain that one becomes unconscious and cannot feel the miseries taking place within the body. In fact, the living entity becomes so helpless at the time of death that although willing, he's forced to give up the body and enter another body. So indeed, the living entity becomes so helpless at the time of death that although he's unwilling, he's forced to give up the body and enter another. So Bhagavad Gita states that by scientific advancement, man may make better temporary living conditions. But still you can't avoid birth, death, old age, disease, and death. These things are under the control of the Lord through the agency of material nature, but people don't understand. Now they're trying to take petrol from the middle of the sea. They're very anxious to ensure future petrol supply, but they don't try to improve the conditions of birth, death, old age, and disease. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, thus a person in ignorance, not knowing anything about his own future life, is certainly defeated in all his activities. Okay, very good. So devotees, we move on to section 2. The serpent wants to leave the city, verses 13, 14, and 15. Let us read the verses. 13. The city's superintendent of police, the serpent, saw that the citizens were being attacked by Kalakanya, and he became very aggrieved to see his own residence set ablaze after being attacked by the Yavanas. 14. As a serpent living within the cavity of a tree wishes to leave when there's a forest fire, so the city's police superintendent, the snake, wished to leave the city due to the fire's severe heat. Verse 15. The limbs of the serpent's body were slackened by the Gandharvas and Yavana soldiers, who had thoroughly defeated his bodily strength. When he attempted to leave the body, he was checked by his enemies. Being thus baffled in his attempt, he began to cry loudly. So verse 13. The city's superintendent of police, the serpent, who honors the serpent it wants to protect. The city means the body, and serpent means the life ears. When he saw that the citizens were being attacked by Kalakanya, and he became very aggrieved to see his own residence set ablaze after being attacked by the Yavanas. So Prabhupada gives us a purport. He says, we have two types of bodies, gross and subtle. At death, of course, the gross body is finished, but the living entity is carried by the subtle body to the next gross body. And the so-called scientists, what can they do? They can't see how the subtle body is working, how it's carrying the soul from one body to another. So the subtle body is figuratively described as the serpent, the city's police superintendent. So when there's fire everywhere, the police chief can't escape also. When there's security and no fire, then the police chief can impose his authority on the people. But when there's all-out attack on the city, he's rendered useless. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, as the life air was ready to leave the gross body, the subtle body also began to experience pain. Verse 14. As a serpent living within the cavity of a tree wishes to leave when there's a forest fire, so the city's police superintendent, the snake, wished to leave the city due to the fire's severe heat. And Srila Prabhupada says that it becomes very difficult for snakes to leave a forest when there's a fire. Other animals may flee due to their long legs, but serpents, only being able to crawl, are generally burnt in the fire. At the last stage, the limbs of the body are not as much affected as the life air. 15. The limbs of the serpent's body were slackened by the Gandharvas and Yavana soldiers who had thoroughly defeated his bodily strength. When he attempted to leave the body, he was checked by his enemies. Being thus baffled in his attempt, he began to cry loudly. So let's have a look at the purport here. At the last stage of life, the gates of the body are choked by the effects of disease caused by the imbalance of bile, mucus, and air. So therefore the living entity can't express his difficulties. Those around just hear gara gara from the dying man. So King Kulashekar says in his Mukundamala Stotra, Krishna Tvadiya Pada Pankaja Panjarantam, yes, etc. So in English, my dear Krishna, please help me die immediately, so that the swan of my mind may be encircled by the stem of your lotus feet. Otherwise, at the time of my final breath, when my throat is choked up, how will it be possible for me to think of you? Yeah, so the swan takes pleasure diving in the water, being encircled by the arms of the lotus flower. This entanglement is sporting joy. If in our healthy condition we think of the lotus feet of the Lord and die, it is most fortunate. But because of the blockages, one may not be able to chant Hare Krishna. So one may forget Krishna. Yeah. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, of course, those who are strong in Krishna consciousness cannot possibly forget Krishna at any stage, because they're accustomed to chanting the Hare Krishna mantra, especially when there's a signal from death. Okay, devotees, so here we go. Section 3, verse 16 to verse 22, Puranjan panics. Verse 16, King Puranjan then began to think of his daughters, sons, grandsons, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, servants, and other associates, as well as his house, his household paraphernalia, and his little accumulation of wealth. Verse 17, King Puranjan was overly attached to his family and conceptions of I and mine. Because he was overly attracted to his wife, he was already quite poverty-stricken. At the time of separation, he became very sorry. Verse 18, King Puranjan was anxiously thinking, alas, my wife is encumbered by so many children. When I pass from this body, how will she be able to maintain all these family members? Alas, she'll be greatly harassed by thoughts of family maintenance. Verse 19, King Puranjan then began to think of his past dealings with his wife. He recalled that his wife would not take her dinner until he had finished his, that she would not take her bath until he had finished his, and that she was always very much attached to him, so much so that if he would sometimes become angry and chastise her, she would simply remain silent and tolerate his misbehavior. Verse 20, King Puranjan continued thinking how, when he was in a state of bewilderment, his wife would give him good counsel, and how she would become aggrieved when he was away from home. Although she was the mother of so many sons and heroes, the king still feared that she would not be able to maintain the responsibility of household affairs. 21. King Puranjan continued worrying. After I pass from this world, how will my sons and daughters, who are now fully dependent on me, live and continue their lives? Their position will be similar to that of passengers aboard a ship wrecked in the midst of the ocean. Although King Puranjan should not have lamented over the fate of his wife and children, he nonetheless did so due to his miserly intelligence. In the meantime, Yavanaraj, whose name was fear itself, immediately drew near to arrest him. Wow. It's getting dramatic. Okay, so let's go back and read the verses again and their purports. And we might not have time to read it all. In fact, I don't expect we will, but anyway, we'll go as far as we can in the time we have. So section 3, Puranjan panics, verse 16 to verse 22. 16. King Puranjan then began to think of his daughters, sons, grandsons, daughters-in-law, sons-in-law, servants and other associates, as well as his house, his household paraphernalia, and his little accumulation of wealth. So Srila Prabhupada gives us a short purport here, that frequently people who are very attached to the material body, they ask a doctor if death is coming. They ask a doctor to prolong his life for some time. But if the doctor can give the patient a few more minutes, the doctor feels successful, but then the patient dies. Hare Krishna. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, This is called the struggle for existence. At the time of death, both patient and physician still think of prolonging life, although all the constituents of the body are practically dead and gone. Verse 17. King Puranjan was overly attached to his family and conceptions of I and mine. Because he was overly attracted to his wife, he was already quite poverty-stricken. At the time of separation, he became very sorry. So Prabhupada explains that it's clear from this verse that at the time of death, the thoughts of material enjoyment don't go away. This indicates the living entity is being carried by the subtle body. Due to false ego, he still wants to enjoy. And for want of that, because he can't, he becomes sad. But he still makes plans in his mind for furthering his existence. And therefore, although giving up the gross body, he's taken to another one. So this transmigration of the subtle body is never visible to material eyes. So when a person gives up the gross body, he thinks it's all over. So the plans for material enjoyment, they are made by the subtle body, and the gross body is the instrument for that. So therefore the gross body is compared to the wife, for the wife is the agent for all sense gratification. So second paragraph, the Sanskrit word stri means expansion. Through the wife, one expands the objects of attraction. Children, the attachment to family members is very prominent at the time of death. We often see that just before leaving the body, a man calls for his son to give him charge of the wife. Please look after my wife. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, he may say, my dear boy, I'm being forced to leave. Please take charge of the family affairs. He speaks in this way, not even knowing his destination. So then we have verse 18. King Puranjan was anxiously thinking, alas, my wife is encumbered by so many children. When I pass from this body, how will she be able to maintain all these family members? Alas, she'll be greatly harassed by thoughts of family maintenance. So all this thinking of his wife shows that Puranjan is engrossed in thoughts of woman. Generally, a chaste woman becomes a very obedient wife, and this causes the husband to become very attached to her. So then he thinks of her at the time of death. And this is very dangerous, as we'll see with King Puranjan as the story unfolds a little further. Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, if one thinks of his wife instead of Krishna at the time of death, he will certainly not return home back to Godhead, but will be forced to accept the body of a woman and thus begin another chapter of material existence. So let us do verse 19 and then we'll finish for today. 19. King Puranjan then began to think of his past dealings with his wife. He recalled that his wife would not take her dinner unless he had finished his, that she would not take her bath until he had finished his, and that she was always very much attached to him, so much so that if he would sometimes become angry and chastise her, She would simply remain silent and tolerate his misbehavior. So anyways, interesting purport here. In this respect, the wife, the traditional wife, Prabhupada says the wife should always be submissive to the husband. And submission, mild behavior, subservience, these are qualities in a wife which make a husband very thoughtful of her. So for family life, it's good for the husband to be attached to the wife, but not for spiritual advancement. So therefore, Krishna consciousness has to be established in every house. If husband and wife are attached to each other in Krishna consciousness, they'll both benefit. Otherwise, if the husband is just too attached to the wife, he becomes a woman in the next life. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, the woman, being overly attached to a husband, becomes a man in her next life. Of course, it is an advantage for a woman to become a man, but it is not at all advantageous for the man to become a woman. Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.